Well, we're talking about the church, and in the last segment we ended off in the 4th century with the Roman Emperor Constantine and him becoming a Christian and wanting to convert the whole Roman Empire. Now we know why that was, but if we go back even further to the Emperor Diocletian, he took the whole empire in order to control it, divided it into provinces, divided the provinces into dioceses, and then he appointed those in charge of the diocese, and he called them vicari. And we know today, if we project ourselves into our modern day church, the word vicar is directly derivative of that appointment. So we had these this whole structure already in place when Constantine became emperor. But let's go back a little further and talk about how before Constantine, way back in the 1st century, how did it move from the Sabbath to the Sunday? Because we know that we're told that we're to keep the Sabbath, but this whole meeting together moved from the Sabbath to Sunday. How did we get to having a Sunday meeting being exclusive and being totally apart from the Jewish Sabbath or the Sabbath that is prescribed in Torah?
Well, actually, that is an excellent question, for the simple reason that today many people, and I've heard this many times, you see it on television, you hear it from the pulpit, many people are under the false impression that Constantine was the one who changed the meeting from Sabbath to Sunday. Have you heard that? That Constantine, the one who changed it? That is not true. Actually, we have a record here in Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr was one of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. This is the book, Ante-Nicene Fathers, and if you will allow me, I will turn to the actual quote here of Justin Martyr. I'm reading from page 186 in the first apology of Justin Martyr that's recorded for us in Ante-Nicene Fathers. This is volume 1, the Ante-Nicene Fathers. Justin Martyr was one of the early church fathers who actually was born at Samaria near Jacob's Well, and he lived from 110 to 165, which means that he was a couple of hundred years before the time of Constantine, before any of the issues that we have been discussing or will discuss relative to the establishment of the day of worship was concerned, tells us in his first apology, again on page 186, and on the day called Sunday. He is specific on the day called Sunday. This is way before the time of Constantine, and in order to clarify that, look down here, Stuart, at the original Greek. It says, te tu heliou legomine himera, on the day of the sun, the day called the day of the sun, or Sunday specifically, to let us know that it's called the day of Helios, the sun god, that all who live in cities or in the country gather together in one place. And the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. And it tells us exactly what they do. And without me reading the whole thing, I'll tell you again, it's on page 186 in volume 1 of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. But here's what I want to especially call your attention to. It says, but Sunday is the day on which we all hold our common assembly, because it is the first day on which God, having wrought a change in the darkness and matter, made the world. And Jesus Christ our Savior on the same day rose from the dead, for he was crucified on the day before that of Saturn, or Saturday, and on the day after that of Saturn, which is the day of the sun, having appeared to his apostles and disciples, he taught them these things which we've submitted to you for your consideration. This is one of the most important statements, one of the most important passages to which you can refer to settle a number of issues that are circulating in the religious world today. First of all, on what day did they worship? Secondly, on what day was Christ crucified? And if you listen to all of the voices that are out there, he was crucified on half a dozen different days. And why it doesn't work out to the 3 days and 3 nights, all kinds of exaggerated statements that are being made. But here, Justin Martyr, who is just a number of decades from the time of Jesus' actual crucifixion, tells us the exact date. It says that he was crucified on, what day does it say here, Stuart? He was crucified on the day before that of Saturn. And on the day after that of Saturn, which is the day of the sun, he also appeared to his apostles and disciples and taught them these things which we've submitted to you for your consideration. So, Constantine had nothing to do with the establishment of Sunday as the day of worship.
What is interesting, apart from, of course, the use of, or the reference to Helios, the sun god, and Saturn, and all these pagan gods after which our days are named, the fact is that they were meeting on the day of the sun, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they were not believers. They were still meeting on the Sabbath as well, and on Sunday after the Sabbath. So tell us about that. Why do we have these 2 days? And we have a confusion today about what is what. But why did we have the Sabbath and we had Sunday?
Well, let me say, Stuart, that we have firm archaeological evidence to answer your question conclusively.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I'm concerned, as an archaeologist, there's no room for discussion on the subject. This is the way it was. The people who followed Jesus or who accepted Jesus as the Messiah before 10 years after his resurrection were all Jews. They were Jews and they worshiped in the synagogue. And the Jews worshiped in the synagogue on what day? Saturday. But in Israel, even until today, this is the way they keep time in Israel, even until today. The Sabbath begins at about 6 o'clock or sundown on Friday evening, and it ends at 6 o'clock or sundown when the first stars appear in the heavens on Saturday. And the Jews came together in the synagogue on the Sabbath. They worshiped as Jews along with all of the Ma'aminim, the believers, who were also worshiping in a Jewish context, although they were believers. They called themselves Ma'aminim. They came together on the Sabbath. They worshiped as Ma'aminim until the first stars appeared in the heavens on the Sabbath evening. And then they came together, the Ma'aminim, the believers, came together in a separate place for what they call the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper, as we know from the New Testament, or some call it communion, but they come together to celebrate the crucifixion, the death of Jesus and his shed blood.
So that's what you were reading for us out of Justin Martyr's apology. A summary of what they were doing on the Sunday, correct?
Yeah, yes.
Gathering together for communion and for the apostles' doctrine and distributing.
It's right here,
Yeah.
on page 186, the whole thing.
So,
But we have found, in an archaeological context,
okay, that was my next question.
and we have excavated a domus ecclesia, or a meeting place for those Ma'aminim, who, after the first stars appeared in the heavens, would excuse themselves, and they would go probably, I would say, 50 to 75 yards, not much farther, and to another place, a separate place apart from the synagogue, that we have discovered at Capernaum. And it was probably the home of Simon Peter's mother-in-law, where Jesus healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law of a fever. But there's one other possibility, and that is that it could have been Jesus' home. A lot of people are not aware of it, but if you read in Mark, the Gospel of Mark, you'll read that Jesus had a house in Capernaum. And so, in all probability, they gathered into the home where Jesus stayed, where he lived, that was considered his home, and they came together for the Lord's Supper as Ma'aminim. And that was a practice that continued, we know from other sources, for probably as long as 400 years, according to some of the writings of Dr. Shlomo Penis, as I mentioned.
So, Jews who accepted Messiah didn't give up their Judaism. They didn't change religions. They stayed Jews. And they went to synagogue on the Sabbath. But then they went to a meeting after the Sabbath on the very first day, Yom Rishon, and they met together as Ma'aminim.
I've got an interesting story to tell you in this regard that you'll not find written down anywhere, because it relates to something we discovered in our archaeological excavations at Tel Kasila. I started excavating at Tel Kasila in Israel in 1973, where we found the Philistine temple. And I was co-director of the excavation for quite a number of seasons, along with some of my students from the university. The director of the excavations was Dr. Amichai Mazar, who is and was for a number of years the professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University. But along the slope of the Tell, on the west side of the Tell, we found some Roman tombs that dated from about 325 of the present era. That would be almost 300 years after the time of Jesus.
And right in the time of Constantine.
Yes. And one of the tombs had an inscription on the edge of the sarcophagus, or the coffin in which the body was placed, and it was in Greek. From 325 in Greek, and it said, He minimin anianu oikos ionios. And the interesting thing is that there's not any word minimin in Greek. In classical Greek, you can try to look it up and find it, you won't find it. Because it was a transliteration of the Hebrew ma'amin. The ma'amin, the minimin, the ma'amin, the believer, anianu, dwells in eternity, or his eternal dwelling, which means that as late as 300 years after the first century, they're still the believers referring to themselves as believers and not as Christians. Now, that's a confusing fact for a lot of people, because you read in Acts where it says, and the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. But that is not correct. What is correct is to remember that all of this material is originally in Hebrew. So you're going to translate this back into Hebrew, what are you going to come up with? That the Talmidim, the disciples, were first called Meshichim, Messianists. Meshichim, that's the term that they use, not Christians, but Meshichim, or the believers, were first called Messianists.